Hello everyone, I hope you have a wonderful day. Before I start, please subscribe and smash that like button. We are almost at our 1,000 subscriber goal. Subscribe so you don't miss out. Without further ado, let's start. Crotchety old man next door harasses me to my breaking point, so I got my revenge. When I first moved into the house, I thought I'd finally caught a break. It was the kind of neighborhood you see on postcards, quiet, lined with trees, and full of neatly kept lawns. The neighbors were polite during my first week. A guy 2 houses down waved every morning as I left for work. Across the street, a family had kids who played basketball in their driveway. It was normal, comfortable. Then there was him, mere misery. He was this old man who lived alone, hunched over like life had punched him in the back. The first time I saw him, he was out front with a broom sweeping his driveway. It was spotless. I figured he was just one of those meticulous types. Didn't think much of it. But then he saw me unloading boxes from my car and came marching over like I'd parked on his lawn. "You planning on leaving your car there all night?" he barked. I looked around confused. It's in my driveway." "Exactly. It's an eyesore. Move it into the garage." I laughed, thinking he was joking. He wasn't. He just stood there, glaring at me. That's when I realized what I was dealing with. A couple of days later, I was planting flowers along the edge of my yard. Nothing fancy, just some petunias. He came out, leaned over the fence, and said, "Those are gonna attract bees, you know. You want to bring bees into the neighborhood?" I guess. Bees sting people. Do you want that liability?" I didn't even answer, just kept digging. But he didn't stop. He stood there for 10 minutes muttering about how I was ruining the neighborhood. I finally went inside to get away from him. It didn't stop there. About a week later, I was having a BBQ with some friends in my backyard. We weren't being loud, just grilling, drinking a couple of beers, talking. All of a sudden, I heard this loud thud against the side of my house. We all froze, and one of my friends whispered, "What the hell was that?" I walked around the side of the house and found a rock sitting on the ground. A big one. I looked over the fence and there he was, standing in his yard, staring at me. "You're disturbing the peace," he yelled. "It's 7 o'clock, I shot back. "We're not even playing music." "You're disturbing me," he said, then turned and went inside. I didn't report it, but I probably should have. My friends joked about it, calling him Rocky, but I was starting to realize how unhinged this guy was. He loved to make rules. For the whole neighborhood, not just me. One time he printed out flyers and stuck them in everyone's mailboxes. "No loud noise after 6 p.m., no litter, keep your lawn mowed weekly." It went on like that, a whole list of demands. He even threatened to report violations to the HOA, except we didn't have an HOA. The worst part was he followed through on his threats. I once left my trash bins out for an extra day because I had to work late. The next morning, I had a notice on my door from the city. I knew it was him because no one else gave a damn about trash bins. Another time, my nephew came to visit for a week. He was 9 at the time and loved riding his scooter up and down the sidewalk. Mr. Misery actually came outside and yelled at him, saying he was tearing up the pavement. My nephew came back inside crying, and when I confronted Mr. Misery about it, he shrugged and said, "Teach your brat some respect." I was steaming, but I didn't want to escalate things. I kept telling myself to ignore him, to rise above it. I figured if I just stayed quiet and followed the rules, he'd leave me alone. I was wrong. The breaking point of that first year came when I got a visit from animal control. My dogs, 2 lab mixes, were in the backyard with me when the officer arrived. She said someone had reported them for being aggressive. My dogs. The same ones that wag their tails at butterflies. I told her the report was nonsense, and she agreed after seeing how gentle they were. But I knew it was him. Who else would have made that call? The officer left, and I stood in my yard glaring at the fence. His kitchen window faced my backyard, and I could see him sitting there, sipping his coffee like he hadn't just tried to have my dogs taken away. I started documenting everything after that. Every time he yelled at me, every time he called the city, every note he left. I had a whole file by the end of the year. I told myself I'd use it someday, but back then, I still hoped it wouldn't come to that. Little did I know, this was just the warm-up. The first time I noticed the camera, I was mowing my lawn. It was on the corner of his deck, mounted on the privacy fence, angled right into my backyard. I wouldn't have noticed it if the sunlight hadn't hit the lens just right. At first I thought, nah, there's no way. Who points a camera into someone else's yard? But it was, clear as day. I stopped the mower and just stared at it for a minute. Then I looked up at his house. Sure enough, his kitchen blinds twitched. He was watching. That night, I decided to confront him. Not aggressively, just to figure out what the hell was going on. I walked over, knocked on his door, and waited. When he finally opened it, he didn't even look surprised. Just stood there in his robe with this smug look like he'd been expecting me. "Your camera's pointing into my backyard," I said. "You need to move it." He tilted his head like I was the crazy one. "It's on my property. It's not about where it is, it's about where it's pointing. I can point my camera wherever I want." I didn't know what to say to that. It was like arguing with a wall. I told him it wasn't right and he just smirked and said, "Then maybe don't do anything you don't want recorded." I walked away fuming. I tried to ignore it, but every time I went outside, I could feel it on me. Watching. I couldn't even hang out with my dogs without glancing up at that stupid thing. Then came the threats. The first one happened when I was raking leaves. I had one of my dogs outside with me, sniffing around like usual. Out of nowhere, I hear him yell from his deck, "You better keep that mutt under control." "She's fine," I yelled back. "She's on my property." "That doesn't mean she's safe," he shouted. "I won't hesitate to protect myself if she steps out of line." I stood there, rake in hand, trying to process what I'd just heard. Protect himself? From what? My dog wasn't even barking. She was wagging her tail at a squirrel. The next day, I came home to find a note stuck to my door. It wasn't even in an envelope, just taped there in plain sight. It said, "Keep your animals quiet. Consider this your final warning." I didn't know what pissed me off more, the note itself or the fact that he didn't have the guts to hand it to me directly. I crumpled it up and threw it in the trash, but I started keeping a closer eye on my dogs after that. A week later, I caught him on his deck again. This time he was holding a broom, just staring at my backyard like he was waiting for something. I opened my door and stepped out, and he immediately yelled, "Control your animals or I will." "They're not doing anything," I shouted back. "What's your problem?" "My problem is you don't belong here," he snapped. "People like you ruin neighborhoods like this." People like me? I didn't even know what he meant by that, but it didn't matter. He'd already made up his mind about me the second I moved in. It escalated from there. He started leaving food scraps near the fence, chicken bones, raw meat, stuff that could hurt my dogs if they got to it. I caught him in the act one night and yelled at him to stop. He just waved me off like it was no big deal. "You're paranoid," he said. "Maybe you should focus on keeping your yard clean instead of watching me." I reported the camera to the police, but they said there wasn't much they could do since it was on his property. They told me to document everything, so I did. Every time he yelled, every time he left something near the fence, every time I caught him spying. The end came when I saw him standing in his backyard with what looked like a BB gun. I was inside, watching from the window. He didn't shoot it, but he held it like he wanted me to see it, like he was daring me to do something. That's when I decided enough was enough. If he wanted to play games, fine. I could play too. I was done letting him call the shots. If he wanted a war, I was going to give him one. But this wasn't going to be some yelling match over the fence. I was going to be smarter about it, hit him where it hurt without giving him a single thing he could use against me. The first thing I did was ramp up the junk mail campaign. I didn't just stop at magazines and religious pamphlets. I signed him up for credit card offers, insurance quotes, gardening catalogs, hunting supply brochures, everything I could think of. I even found a few places that offered free samples. A week later, I noticed his mailbox was so stuffed, he had to start carrying a bag out to collect it all. Then I got more creative. I ordered a fake congratulations package for a lottery win and had it shipped to his address. It came in a big flashy envelope with bold letters screaming, "You could be a millionaire." I watched from my window as he opened it and then stood there for a good 5 minutes scratching his head. He looked around like he thought someone was pranking him. I guess he wasn't wrong. One afternoon, I decided to mess with his precious lawn. He was obsessed with it, mowed it twice a week, watered it every other day, and kept it looking like a golf course. So I sprinkled some clover seeds along the edge of his yard where it met mine. Nothing crazy, just enough to make him notice. A few weeks later, I saw him on his knees pulling them out one by one. But the big move came when I set up the night crafting operation. I went to the craft store and picked up supplies, a big metal sheet, wooden letters, and black spray paint. That night, around 11 p.m., I dragged an old table into my carport, which was just a few feet from his bedroom wall. I set everything up and cranked the loudest, most chaotic metal music I could find. I wasn't subtle about it either. I sang along, banged the table with my tools, and made as much noise as possible. I saw his bedroom light flick on, but he didn't come outside. A few minutes later, I spotted flashing lights at the end of the street. Sure enough, a cop car rolled up. I turned everything off and waited inside. The cop didn't even knock on my door. He just circled the house, saw there was no noise, and left. As soon as he drove off, I went back out and turned the music back on. By the time I finished, I'd made a sign that said "fuck off" in bold letters. I let it dry overnight and hung it the next morning on an old swing set frame facing his backyard. I made sure it was tilted just right so it would block his view of my yard. To top it all off, I decided to give his camera one final show. Late one night, I went out to my backyard wearing nothing but a pair of underwear. I stood directly in front of the camera, arms crossed, and didn't move for a solid 10 minutes. Then I waved and went back inside. The next morning, the camera was gone. But I wasn't done. I started leaving random objects in my yard just to mess with him. A broken chair, an old tire, even a garden gnome I found at a thrift store. I'd move them around every couple of days just enough to make it look like I was up to something. I could see him peeking through his blinds, probably trying to figure out what the hell I was doing. At one point, I accidentally spilled a bag of birdseed along the fence line. Within a day, his yard was full of birds, pigeons, sparrows, even a few crows. I heard him out there clapping his hands and shouting, trying to scare them off. It didn't take long for the tables to turn. He started spending more time inside, blinds drawn, lights off. The yelling stopped. The threats stopped. He was finally realizing I wasn't going to back down. But I wasn't ready to stop yet, not until I knew for sure he'd gotten the message. After the camera came down, I thought maybe I'd finally won. For a couple of days, there wasn't a peep from him. But just when I started to let my guard down, he found a new way to be a pain in my ass. It started with his floodlights. He installed these obnoxiously bright security lights on his deck, angled directly at my backyard. Every night, as soon as the sun set, they'd click on and light up my yard like it was a damn football field. I could barely sit outside without feeling like I was under a spotlight. I marched over to his door the first night they went up. When he answered, I pointed at the lights and said, "Turn them off." "They're for security," he said, acting like I'd just asked him to move a mountain. "They're pointed at my yard," I shot back. "Well, maybe I'm worried about what's happening in your yard." Then he slammed the door in my face. The next day, I went out and bought a giant umbrella, the kind you see at fancy outdoor cafes. I set it up right in the middle of my yard and tilted it so it blocked the light from hitting my patio. It didn't cover the whole yard, but it was enough to make a point. That night, he turned the lights up even brighter. I didn't even know they had settings, but apparently they did. It was like he was daring me to do something. So, I did. I borrowed a friend's old telescope, dragged it into my backyard, and set it up right in view of his deck. I didn't even use it. I just pointed it at his house and left it there. He must have noticed because the next morning the telescope was covered in eggs. I didn't bother cleaning it off. Instead, I grabbed a bucket of leftover paint from my garage, dipped a big brush in it, and painted a target on an old piece of plywood. Then I propped it up against the fence facing his house. It wasn't subtle, but at this point I didn't care. He responded by blasting polka music from his deck, loud enough that I could hear it inside my house. It went on for 3 hours straight. When it finally stopped, I went outside and saw him on his deck, sipping a glass of something and smirking at me. The next day, I decided to up the ante. I bought a cheap kiddie pool, filled it with water, and dumped a bag of powdered food coloring into it, bright red. Then I let it sit out in the sun, hoping it would stain the grass underneath. By the time he came outside and saw it, it looked like I'd set up a murder scene in my backyard. "What the hell is that?" he yelled from his deck. "Art," I said, waving. That night, I caught him peering over the fence with a flashlight. I didn't say anything, just stood there holding my garden hose. He didn't even notice me until I turned it on and sprayed him right in the face. He cursed and stomped back inside, but I could hear him muttering the whole way. The next morning, I woke up to find my trash cans tipped over and garbage scattered all over my lawn. I didn't see him do it, but I knew it was him. I took my time cleaning it up, making sure to wave every time I saw his curtains move. By the end of the week, we were in a full-blown standoff. He started piling his yard waste along our shared fence line, branches, leaves, even a broken rake. I responded by planting marigolds along the same line. I knew he hated flowers, especially ones with bright colors. One day, I came home to find a fake for sale sign stuck in my yard. It had my house number on it, but the phone number was some random hotline. I yanked it out and threw it on his lawn, but he just left it there for 2 days. Then came the balloons. I bought a bunch of helium balloons and tied them to the fence, letting them float just high enough to peek over into his yard. They weren't anything special, just bright and obnoxious. Every time he came outside, I could see him glaring at them. By the end of the week, the floodlights were gone. The polka music stopped, and for the first time in years, his deck was empty. I wasn't stupid, though. I knew he wasn't done. This was just the calm before the storm. After the floodlights came down, things got quiet, too quiet. It was the kind of silence that makes you suspicious, like when kids suddenly stop making noise and you know they're up to something. I kept expecting him to show up with another stupid trick, but days passed and nothing happened. Then one morning, I noticed something strange. His curtains were drawn. All of them. Normally, he kept at least one window uncovered so he could spy on the neighborhood. But now, it was like his house had gone into lockdown. I didn't trust it. I figured he was planning his next move, so I decided to stay one step ahead. I started spending more time outside, watering the lawn, cleaning my already clean car, walking my dogs back and forth along the fence line. I made sure to keep my back straight, my head high, like I was daring him to try something. A week later, I noticed the first real sign of trouble. A moving truck pulled up in front of his house. At first, I thought he was finally leaving, but then I saw the delivery guys unloading a bunch of new furniture. They carried in a massive leather recliner, a glass coffee table, and what looked like a custom bookshelf. I stood there watering my lawn, pretending not to watch, but I couldn't figure out what was going on. The next day, I saw him outside for the first time in a week. He was standing on his deck talking to some guy in a suit. The guy was holding a clipboard and nodding a lot. They were too far away for me to hear what they were saying, but I didn't like the look of it. When the suit left, Mr. Misery glanced over at my yard, and for the first time, he didn't say a word. That night, I found out why. Around midnight, I heard a loud engine rumbling outside. I peeked out my window and saw a tow truck pulling up in front of his house. A few minutes later, they were loading his car onto the flatbed. He didn't come outside to stop them. The next morning, I saw him standing in his driveway staring at the empty spot where his car had been. He looked off. Not angry, not smug, just kind of deflated. He didn't even notice me watching from my porch. A couple of days later, I saw the moving truck again. This time, they were loading stuff into it. Boxes, furniture, even his stupid broom. I didn't dare hope, but as the day went on, it became clear he was packing up for good. By late afternoon, the truck was full. He stood on his porch for a long time, just staring at the street. I thought maybe he was going to say something, but he just shook his head, got in his car, and drove off. When the truck pulled away, I walked over to his yard, half expecting some kind of final trick, but it was empty. The grass was still perfectly trimmed, the windows still spotless, but there was no sign of him. For the first time in years, the neighborhood felt normal. A week later, I heard from one of the neighbors that he'd moved to a retirement community about an hour away. Apparently, he'd fallen behind on his property taxes and had no choice but to sell the house. I didn't feel bad for him, not even a little. The new neighbors moved in a few months later, a young couple with a baby on the way. They waved when they saw me and even brought over cookies to introduce themselves. It was the first time I'd felt welcome in my own neighborhood since I moved in. Now, every time I see my dogs playing in the yard or hear the kids across the street riding their bikes, I think about Mr. Misery. Not with anger or regret, but with a quiet satisfaction. I didn't just survive him, I won. In the end, the neighborhood finally felt like a place I could call home. The new couple next door was friendly, the kids down the street played outside again, and for the first time in years, my backyard was mine. No cameras, no floodlights, no yelling over the fence. Sometimes I catch myself glancing at his old house, half expecting to see his miserable face in the window. But it's just empty now, waiting for its next chapter. I didn't just stand up to him, I outlasted him. And that's all I needed. Game over. I won. Thanks for watching. If you liked the story, hit subscribe. See you in the next one.